Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the presentation of the International Compendium of Entrepreneurship Policies, What's Next for Entrepreneurship Policy. This webinar is organized by the OECD and the ICSB. My name is Cynthia Lavison. I'm a policy analyst here at the OECD and I'll be your host today. So before we start, a few housekeeping notes. We'll ask you to stay muted for the 90 minutes of the webinar unless you're asking a question or speaking. This will ensure better audio quality for everybody. We'd like to remind you that you have the possibility to ask a question at any time by using the raising your hand function in the participants tab. And you can also type in your question in the chat and we'll do our best efforts to answer as many questions as possible under the time constraints we have today. And finally, as you may have seen as a pop-up when you logged in, this meeting is being recorded and the recording should be made available online shortly after the end of the meeting. So without further ado, I see that we already have quite a few participants logged in. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, which will be Céline Kaufmann, head of the SME and Entrepreneurship Unit of the OECD. We will come to the floor to say a few welcome words. Céline, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, for the introduction and welcome to all to this joint OECD-ICSB webinar. It's actually very exciting to see that so many of you could join us for the discussion. I think you are 70 something, but we expect much more people during the session. And we are very happy to welcome you for the presentation of the new International Compendium of Entrepreneurship Policies and for a discussion on the future of entrepreneurship policy, where I hope you can bring your insights. Let me say that we're extremely pleased to partner with the International Council on Small Business for this event. I would like to thank Ayman for the very good contribution and cooperation over the past, and his team as well for actually driving the organization of this event with my colleague Jonathan Potter and his team that are also on the call, obviously. And I would like to thank as well the panelists that are joining us today. We really look forward to hearing your perspective about what is next for entrepreneurship policy. Again, we have the compendium, which is, you know, a milestone in the work that we've been doing, but really we want to hear your perspective on the way forward. On our side, you know that the compendium is the result of the OECD extensive body of work on supporting entrepreneurship and strengthening entrepreneurial ecosystems. What it does is to provide a reference tool to the types of entrepreneurship policies that can be introduced. And the report draws on the lessons that we've learned from international experience to help actually policymakers understand some of the good practices and guide their future policy directions in this area. And on that note, I would like to thank the team, the authors for the report, Jonathan Potter, David Halabitsky, and Cynthia Levison that you've heard already, and you'll hear from John and David later on in the session. And let me underline as well that that work is not only the result of these many years of work on entrepreneurship policy, but it comes at a very critical time. We know that entrepreneurship policy obviously has a key role to play in building back our economies. In recent years, young firms have been creating about half of new jobs on average across OECD countries, and innovation by young firms significantly contributes to aggregate productivity growth, for example, accounting for half of it in the US. And we know we also depend critically on startups to generate innovations into the economy that support the green transition and can help us pursue new social inclusion agendas. So for all these reasons, we believe it's a very topical theme to address with you. And we really look forward to hearing the discussion today about what makes for entrepreneurship policy success. And I would like to thank you again for joining us and to encourage you as well to actively participate by raising questions or sharing your views following the report presentation and the panel discussion, but even later after this webinar by writing to us and sharing your thoughts on the report and on what comes next. On this note, I will hand it over back to you, Cynthia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Celine, for this great introduction. Next, I'd like to invite to the floor Ayman El-Tarabishi, the President and CEO of ICSB, who also will welcome you to this event. Ayman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Celine. Greetings and everyone from around the world, from Washington, D.C. My name is Ayman Tarabishi, President and CEO of the International Council for Small Business. ICSB was founded in 1955. We are the oldest and largest nonprofit organization promoting entrepreneurship and SMEs worldwide. We are also the founders of MSME Day at the United Nations on June 27. And I would like to first thank OECD for partnering with ICSB on this important webinar and on the future of entrepreneurship in terms of the compendium of the report. But also I would like to warmly welcome Celine to OECD on behalf of the ICSB family worldwide. You are part of the ICSB family here, so we want to give you a warm welcome. And thank you for joining us as part of an initiative worldwide to help promote SMEs and micro SMEs and entrepreneurship worldwide. And a personal thank you for Jonathan Potter for putting together this webinar, for putting this idea together, for doing a lot of the legwork and hard work behind the scenes to make it happen. So ICSB thanks Jonathan for all your hard work. This report is important for many reasons. And we are all living through COVID-19 crisis. A lot of countries are suffering. A lot of micro and small businesses and entrepreneurs are feeling the effects of it. And this morning, I was just listening to CNN, and they were talking that 1/3 of small businesses and entrepreneurs have closed shop in New Jersey. And that's just one state. Imagine worldwide the effects that are happening here. And so our role is critical. Our role as policymakers, as researchers, as educators, as decision makers have to come to the forefront to help support entrepreneurs worldwide. The role of OECD is critical. And OECD is what we call at ICSB is the platform for the best data and knowledge produced worldwide. They have the most state-of-the-art researchers, they have significant insights, they do collaborative work, which is impressive. We sit in the working party here and we see how the reports are created and how they are discussed. So they are really a best practice. And ICSB recognizes OECD for the tremendous work that they're doing and the importance of the work, not just the work, but the importance of the work here. This session is very important. As we look at the report, as we look at the data and the information and the results that are coming out, and here, the question that I ask, and I ask all of you, is what is next? How do we apply this report to everything that we do? So, and I ask you to kind of look at the report, listen to the results, the questions, and keep asking yourself in your mind, how can I use this? How can I apply this in whatever I am doing in terms of work, in terms of outreach? And let us continue this conversation more and more after this report. And I'll stop here. I want to thank all of OECD for the amazing work that they have done, recognizing everybody, and then back to you.
Thank you very much for this excellent introduction. Next, we'll get into the report itself that has been already mentioned a few times. So I would like to invite my colleague David Halabisky to take the floor and tell us a bit more about the International Compendium of Entrepreneurship Policies. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everybody, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss this report with you today. Now, this report is the result of a collaboration that the OECD had with the Japanese SME agency. So we would like to acknowledge and thank the agency for their support for this work, particularly Mr. Ku Kawaragi, the Deputy Director of the Entrepreneurship Division, as well as Mr. Masaya Sugimoto from the Permanent Delegation of Japan to the OECD. Now, this work was launched to respond to a question that they put to us, which was how can countries stimulate and support productive entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship? Now, in using the term productive entrepreneurship, we are referring to the creation of businesses that have job creation and innovation potential. So they have the ability to contribute more than a single person firm, but they might not necessarily have the capabilities to achieve the dramatic growth rates of gazelles and unicorns. And so we set out to produce this good practice compendium to provide advice to governments based on lessons that we are drawing from across the OECD membership. Now, the report is structured in two parts. Part one discusses entrepreneurship policy, its roles, challenges it faces, approaches and success factors, while part two illustrates the discussion with concrete examples. So the report has 16 policy cases that are discussed and analyzed, and they are grouped in three categories. One are policies for institutional conditions. Second are policies that are targeted directly at entrepreneurs. And third are policies that are aimed at supporting and developing entrepreneurial ecosystems. So the report gives a good overview of how policy is intervening to support entrepreneurship across different OECD countries today. Now, my colleague John Potter will present the report in more detail. And of course, I, along with my other colleagues, look forward to hearing from the panelists and as well from the participants on how we can build on this current view of entrepreneurship policy and take it forward so that we have entrepreneurship policy for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Now we'll hear from John Potter from the OECD, head of the Entrepreneurship Policy Analysis Unit. We will tell us more about the contents of the compendium. John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you, everybody. Is it good? Do we see the slides? Do we hear me? All right. Well, great. So, you know, this is a good moment in time to be able to present, you know, a new publication that's just been launched, and we hope that it'll be useful to people. The International Compendium of Entrepreneurship Policies. This publication, what we think it achieves is that it shows the types of entrepreneurship policies that governments are using in the OECD area, which is its focus. What types of entrepreneurship policy are being used? It identifies the rationale for the policy intervention, and it discusses some of the issues there. It gives these examples of good practice policies, so the 16 examples for inspiration. And it identifies some common pitfalls and some common success factors. And it also talks about the importance of evaluation of policy as the key guide to knowing what works and what doesn't work. And it discusses how to evaluate. Now, this is an area, entrepreneurship policy, in which there is a lot to debate. So we're not setting out here a definitive picture of entrepreneurship policy, of the rationale, of all the approaches needed. There's a lot more that we need to know about. There's a lot of discussion that's needed, and we're hoping that this group who's joined this webinar here will help in this discussion. But a couple of key areas for debate that we can focus in on today. First off, which types of entrepreneurship policy are effective? I don't think that we can say that all entrepreneurship policy is effective. The evaluation evidence doesn't support that. The evaluation evidence is mixed. We have to recognize that there's a great variety in the types of policy instruments that come under the heading of entrepreneurship policy. And there's a great variety of the entrepreneurs and startups that policy is trying to support. And of course, the context varies according to country, according to region, according to whether it's a boom period or a bust period. So how do we target the right groups? And how do we get the policy mix right? That's one big area of discussion. And then another big area that we can focus on today, how does the policy need to evolve in the future? Our report was done basically in 2019. It's basically pre-COVID. So COVID has happened. We have digitalization, we have the needs of greening the economy, the need of becoming more socially sustainable. What we know is that entrepreneurship will be needed to support the transition. And I think what our publication does is provide some indications of how to promote entrepreneurship, but we haven't in this case gone into how to develop specifically green policies, for example. So this is a new area that we need to discuss with you. Now, what I'm going to try and do here is give you a quick overview of the content of the compendium. So, you know, there's 5 parts to this. One is the objectives, what it says about the objectives and challenges of entrepreneurship policy, what it says about the types of intervention. And then one of our contributions is to map the elements of entrepreneurship policy against different policy cases. So I'll take you through that and some lessons that we can draw from the case studies in the book and some conclusions. So let's start with the objectives of policy and the challenges that it faces. We've heard a little bit about this already. What's the aim of entrepreneurship policy? So essentially, yes, to increase the startup rate. And that can be done in 2 ways. One, by building a pipeline of potential entrepreneurs who will come forward in the future to start. And the second way is to facilitate that startup once the person is motivated and makes the decision to go ahead. So yes, to increase the startup rate. The problem is that's been referred to that on average, the enterprises that are started up are very small. The modal picture is a solo entrepreneur who provides work for themselves, but doesn't have a great economic impact on growth or employment. And so another issue for entrepreneurship policy is how do we improve the quality of businesses created, or at least focus on those that have got some growth and innovation potential. And so improve the quality, but also stimulate growth. And here, our publication comes down in the middle. So we are promoting a focus on productive entrepreneurship. This is entrepreneurship with job creation and innovation content. But it's not exclusively the gazelles and the unicorns. It's not only those firms. There's been too much attention on how to focus, how to stimulate gazelles and unicorns at the very peak. Not enough attention to the more modest enterprises that nonetheless create some jobs, create some innovation. And we need to rebalance that focus, particularly because the gazelles are very few in number and very hard to identify in advance. So that's our focus, productive entrepreneurship. Now, what are the success factors? What we say in this publication is 1, focus on those entrepreneurs and enterprises with potential for growth. And what that also means is avoid the businesses that are going to enter into excess supply sectors where failure, where closure, where displacement is likely to be very high. That's one success factor. A second is, of course, to build in evaluation with proportionate resources, with adequate resources to follow the survival, the employment, the sales changes, and to early monitor in order to be able to revise, adjust the policy where necessary. Third, be sensitive to structural conditions like regional conditions. Be sensitive to new developments like digitalization. But fourth, get the implementation right. The implementation is as important as the original idea. The implementation, the delivery is as important as the policy design for effectiveness. You have to choose the right delivery agency, provide them adequate resources, set the targets for them, monitor, feedback, design in collaboration with those who will deliver. Fifth point, develop in packages, not just individual isolated policy initiatives, but to see the cohesive whole, to see how linkages can be fostered across programs, how entrepreneurs can be referred from one to another. And don't overlook the institutional conditions. That means things like culture, things like regulations, things like competition. We have got a threefold typology of policy intervention in the publication. David mentioned it. One type of policy is to influence the institutions, attitudes, regulations. A second type of policy is a policy targeted directly at entrepreneurs, helping them to acquire resources like knowledge, finance, networks. And the third type of policy, which is relatively new, and is being much spoken about now, is the policy for the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the holistic package of policy that combines institutions and direct support in regional or national ecosystems. So we look at all of those in the publication. And this is a bit the approach that you will find there. We've got three different types of table that show the case studies and what they illustrate. And the first element here is the target of intervention, the main focus of intervention. So is it a national or a regional initiative? Who's being targeted? Is it the investors or early stage entrepreneurs or students? Has the policy been evaluated? We use these tables to help the reader to navigate their way through, so they don't have to read from page 1 to the end of the publication. They can select where they see an interesting issue. And then we have the key performance indicators. This is one of our key messages, one of the key messages of the report and of the Working Party on SMEs and Entrepreneurship, that monitoring and evaluation is critical for policy effectiveness. And that requires setting out clear, measurable objectives in advance. And we have a preference for 3 core indicators that will always be picked up: sales, employment, survival. You need a set of KPIs to monitor your progress. And so we identify in these tables which KPIs are being used by which programs. And then we have something at the level of the success factors. What are the success factors being illustrated by the cases, the 16 cases? So you have efficient goal setting, for example. Have stakeholders been involved in design? Investing resources in awareness raising to generate interest and awareness about the existence of a program that entrepreneurs can participate in. So we have along here a set of potential success factors, and you can dip in to the publication and look at those. But we also try and draw out some overall messages. What are the lessons from the policy examples overall? 4 major messages that we highlight. The first is it's important to involve the stakeholders in identifying the issues that policy has to address and in the design of the programs to make sure that the programs are delivered in a format that matches the capabilities of the partner organizations, meets the needs of the potential recipients, and they can help to design the KPIs, of course, the stakeholders. A second is to invest resources in what we call non-core activities. So by that we mean in awareness raising, minimizing the administrative burden, allocating resources to administration. So there's not blockages and delays that the entrepreneurs complain about. We can't get involved in these programs, too much paperwork. That requires investment, in fact, as does the evaluation and monitoring. The third lesson is it's important to build on existing actors and structures and leverage existing capacity. There's an ecosystem out there of support organizations. You have to link into that. And then the fourth point is to offer training and peer learning and other types of support for delivery staff, for program managers. If you're in a hub and spoke approach, put the spokes together so they can share knowledge amongst themselves, for example. And of course, there are 16 different programs in the report that you can read more about. And the way it works is you take, for example, the regional business development centers in Denmark, the 5 one-stop shops. What does that illustrate? One of the things it illustrates is that they set up a control group and a treatment group. They compared over time the change in sales, employment, and survival of the two groups. That's a good practice. The SIVA incubators and business gardens in Norway, they didn't set up new incubators. They went to universities and other partners, provided them funding and capacity building for them to deliver their own incubation. The USA, the cooperative venturing, is sitting at the center of a network with industry experts, the investor liaison points in universities, the links with the regional bank, with the state loan fund, with the Women's Business Center. That's how they provided the collaborative mentoring. The Canada Accelerator and Incubation Program set up a performance measurement framework in advance. They wanted to see the extra services being provided by incubators as a result of their support. And Startup Estonia is an example of bottom-up engagement of the ecosystem actors, monthly community meetups, surveys, and so on. So time's short, 3 main conclusions. The target, we argue, should be productive entrepreneurship and not necessity entrepreneurship with a low survival opportunity. We need a combination of measures coming together, the institutional environment, the direct support, the ecosystem building. And a large part of policy success or failure is down to delivery. It's down to things like selecting the participants right, raising the awareness of the existence of the program, linking with existing actors and so on. So this compendium, it helps to identify some of these good practices. And that's what we're going to need more of going forward. Thank you very much for joining us to debate all this. Here's some details about how to get more information. And I hand back to the moderator.
Thank you, John, for this very concise but very rich presentation of our reports. Now we'll move on to panel discussion, and I will briefly call the speakers to the floor. But before that, I just want to remind you, following the questions in the chat, you can read the report online at the link we have shared, but you can, if you need a PDF copy, you can also contact us and we'll do our best to connect you. So without further ado, we know moving on to a panel discussion that will be moderated by Professor Ayman El Tarabichi, who you've heard from before. And this panel will be composed by Professor Colin Mason from the University of Glasgow in the UK, who also contributed to the report. We'll also hear from Torsten Andersen, Deputy Director General of the Danish British Authority in Denmark and WP SME delegate. We'll also have in this panel Andrew MacDonald, Chair of the Small Business Investment Committee, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Ana Costa Paula, Senior Advisor, Business Policy, Ministry of Economy of Portugal, and also a WP SME delegate. And last but not least, Vicky Stiliano from the Institute of Public Accountants in Australia, and who is also a member of the ICSB board. So welcome our panelists, and I'm handing out the floor to Ayman El Tarabishi. Ayman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Jonathan, and David for an exceptional report and presentation. For all the attendees that are watching, we will be sharing all the information with you with the follow-up. So don't worry, this is part of the process that we'll share everything here. But let's get to the questions here, because the questions really will drive a lot of discussions and the next steps here. So we have a set of some of questions that we already prepared here. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce each panelist here with their title and then ask them the question. And I kindly ask them to go to the heart of the matter with clear and concise statements, because these statements will be captured in a report and then they'll do follow-up with it. So let me start first. I am delighted and honored to ask that my first question is with Professor Colin Mason. He is a professor of entrepreneurship and management at the University of Glasgow. Professor Mason, here's my question. One of the principles of successful policy set out in the Compendium is the entrepreneurship support that requires comprehensive packages linking up different support organizations in entrepreneurial ecosystems. That's a lot to process. There has been some criticism, I say a lot of criticism, that there is too many entrepreneurship support organizations, and the support needs to be rationalized, a logic to this support. What is your view on this criticism? And that's a tough question, but let's start with the tough question.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I've heard this criticism very often. You kind of map out on a whiteboard all the different organizations that are providing entrepreneurial support, and the kind of tidy mind of the administrator thinks we've got too many of these, we can surely rationalize. I think if we did that, we would really undermine entrepreneurial support. As we all know, the entrepreneurial community is heterogeneous. Different entrepreneurs have got different support requirements, different types of businesses have different support requirements, and crucially, entrepreneurs need different kinds of support as their ventures develop. No organization is capable of meeting all these needs of this diverse population of entrepreneurs. And of course, entrepreneurs need to have their support accessible to them, so that inevitably there'll be some geographical duplication of support. That's inevitable. I did a study that was published earlier this year in the journal Local Economy, where we looked at an entrepreneurial support program at my university. And what that study showed was how successful ventures draw on different support and different resources from the ecosystem as they grow. Initially, they look to the university for support and help, and then the university can link them to the wider ecosystem, so they kind of go beyond the university to draw on variety of support. And indeed, some of our most successful ventures then look beyond the city and the national ecosystem to access resources, an incubator, an accelerator program in the US, for example. The phrase that somebody said, it takes an ecosystem to create a successful startup, not just one single organization.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent, excellent answer. And I know some people are on the fence either way or not, but I think your answer was exceptional. And I agree with you. So I'll leave it to that. Let me start because there's a lot of questions. Let's go to the next question here. I'd like to introduce Mr. Torsten Andersen, Deputy Director General at the Danish Business Authority. And we always see our colleagues at the Working Party, and I always pay extra attention to our colleagues from Denmark here with their ideas and initiatives here. So here's my question, Mr. Torsten. What improvements do you think Denmark has made in the last 5 years and in its entrepreneurship policies? What has the Danish government basically done to increase the impact of its interventions? And have you made any changes to your entrepreneurship policy objectives? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I actually will start out by confronting the former speaker, because I think what we've done throughout the last 5 years is, amongst other things, that we've cleaned up all of our entrepreneurship support organizations. We mapped out how many we actually had, and we had several hundreds, and that's for a little country like Denmark with 5 million inhabitants. And we basically cleaned out a lot of them, and are now in a situation where we have fewer, stronger organizations supporting entrepreneurs in Denmark. Of course, that's not the same as you only need 1 or 2. You need more, but you can. I think that in many places you need to clean out and clean up in the public support schemes. That also means that we've gone to this thing that Jonathan was calling an ecosystem approach. I think we've been trying to move in this direction for the past 5 years. It's difficult. It's difficult to close down public organizations and instead nurturing a private ecosystem. But it's what we've been working on for a number of years. Now, regarding these business development centers, the regional business development centers that we have in the report as the best practice, we have been strengthening them. We've been building up a digital platform so that everything that an entrepreneur is confronted with can basically be sorted out digitally, and in the place that he needs coaching, mentoring, and so on from the public side, it is underpinned digitally and based on best practice. And of course, as John was also pointing to, we try to make sure that this can be evaluated through strong KPIs. So I think that's what I will stick to saying now. It's been hard work, and it is hard work to actually let's say, do a cleaning up exercise, but it's also worth the effort.
Thank you, Mr. Thorstensen. So it seems in Denmark has taken the step of saying, maybe there's too many, let's kind of refocus, reprioritize, and double down on the ones that we see potential and make them stronger here. While, Dr. Mason mentioned saying it's good to have as many as possible, and let's see how it evolves. So again, as an attendee, you tell us what you think. Good to have many, or to strengthen some, or a mixture of both. Let's see how this moves forward. Let me ask the question into another organization, the European Bank on Reconstruction and Development. Let me warmly introduce my colleague and dear friend, Mr. Andrew MacDonald, Chair of the Small Business Investment Committee at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He's my neighbor in the OECD when we sit together. So here's my question, Andrew. The Compendium argues that entrepreneurship policy should support a wide range of entrepreneurs, but focus resources on ventures with potential for growth. So focus on the ones with growth. How do you think governments can get the balance right between widespread support and some focused investment in growth potential firms? Are there differences in the policy's needs for the two different groups? The floor is yours.
Ayman, thank you very much. Probably drawing on the experience that Torsten's had in his country, I think it underlines sort of my reaction to the question. It's about, and Jonathan did mention it before, it's about regional dimensions, because it's not just a one size fits all, and also over time that moves and you can see what's working and what's not working. So I think taking that as the baseline, you can do more than one thing at a time. And you just don't concentrate, as Colin was saying, on the one single company doesn't make an ecosystem. So you've got that interplay between it, and you've got to have, I think, from my perspective, be flexible and have your view of supporting both at the same time. And we know that they all have different needs. And I think one of the ways those needs manifest themselves is actually in the different financing appetite and channels at the different times of their development as well. When it's more mature, you have probably a better, not still the high growth part of the business, but you've got an access to finance which is going to be more along the traditional banking methods. But in your early days, in your startup days, you really go looking for the venture capital, for the angel investors who are going to be able and be quick and nimble, but also will bring with them the sort of mentoring and hand on the shoulder, helping to get you really going from all their experiences as well. We see in our venture capital business, we have an external advisory board, and they bring something which we don't have inside the bank. They bring experience of real VC businesses, because they invest and they spend time in all of their businesses. So I think you've got your coaching, your mentoring, your advice. That's all very different to if you're more established, and then some of the policy can focus on doing tax breaks and everything like that, because you actually have a business which is up and running. So I'll probably leave it there, but I think it's incumbent upon governments to do both.
Thank you, Andrew. And I like your approach of saying it depends really on the level of the organization, where they are, and how the intervention works here. I think this is what Torsten also mentioned, saying about looking at all the different groups here and saying which one is at what stage and how we can support them more. So it complements each other here. Let me ask our next speaker here, Ana Costa Paula. She is the head of unit at the Business Policy Unit in the Ministry of Economy and Digital Transition in Portugal. And Ana, can you tell us about your new Startup Portugal initiative? What has the government been doing, and what do you think should come next under this context and report?
Hi, Hammond. Thank you very much. Let me just start by saying that the Portuguese startup ecosystem is one of the best assets Portugal has at the moment, with small but growing companies representing over 1% of Portuguese GDP. It is a highly innovative ecosystem based on technologies. We have about 2,500 registered startups and 3 unicorns, Farfetch, OutSystems, and Talkdesk. Portugal ranks 39 among 190 economies in terms of ease of doing businesses, according to the Doing Business 2020, and Lisbon is the 6th most desirable startup city in Europe to make businesses, according to Startup Heatmap Europe survey report. Portugal was also considered by the European Innovation Scoreboard 2020 the 12th most innovative country in the European Union, becoming part of the group of strongly innovative countries. All of these results have been possible through a strong investment in technological infrastructures, a strong involvement of the entrepreneurial ecosystem agents, and a set of structural financing and entrepreneurship measures with a special focus on digital entrepreneurship. In 2016, the National Strategy for Entrepreneurship, Startup Portugal, was launched by the government with 3 main goals: to create and support the national ecosystem, to attract national and foreigner investors, and to accelerate the growth of Portuguese startups in foreigner markets. During the first 2 years, the program advanced with the implementation of initial 15 measures, distributed over the mentioned pillars, and the launch of flagship measures. Relevant launch measures include startup-specific funding mechanisms, such as funding and co-funding for business angels, venture capital and new instruments such as equity crowdfunding and peer-to-peer financing, setting of incubators, accelerators, and Fab Labs networks, fostering participation in world-level initiatives such as the Web Summit hosted in Lisbon until 2028. In fact, this year edition will start next Wednesday, virtually, but it will happen. And after, in July 2018, in order to address emerging challenges, the government introduced Startup Portugal Plus program with the consolidation of successful measures of the original program and the launch of 20 new measures. New financing instruments were introduced through specific support to energy, tourism, and trade sectors, and through the creation of an international co-investment fund to promote the attraction of venture capital funds in Portugal. The pandemic outbreak has had an impact in all areas of society, and of course, entrepreneurship ecosystem is included. Many companies saw their activity affected and others have to close temporarily or permanently. Some were forced to change their business models to better respond to market needs, while others saw an increase in the number of opportunities. With this in mind, Portugal continues its efforts in order to have a more resilient and open entrepreneur ecosystems. This includes providing visibility to Portuguese entrepreneurs, developing initiatives that will lead to the participation of startups in international events, and have more international investors to partner with our national investors in order to build bigger and more scalable firms. On the other hand, to mitigate the impact caused by COVID-19 and to the startup ecosystem, it is important to identify the most pressing needs that can be addressed through new measures or actions and measure how entrepreneurs feel about the future economic recovery scenario. National initiatives aim to tackle short-term challenges, supporting short-term liquidity and availability of funding, taking into account the particularities of a startup ecosystem and how it was hit by the pandemic. At the same time, we are also focused on reduced structural barriers to entrepreneurship, providing incentives for startups to identify and benefit from long-term opportunities and boost their capabilities and potential. For example, the Portuguese government issued a relief fund exclusively for startups to help mitigate the impact of COVID-19. This new measure adds up with initial relief package of SMEs where startups were also included. Just to close my intervention, and according to impact of the COVID-19 in the National Startups Ecosystem Report from June 2020, and despite the current situation of uncertainties regarding the future of the global economy, most startups were working normally and showed optimism about economic recovery, some of which even anticipate a trend of expansion. For about 42% of startups, the pandemic generated new opportunities, demonstrating that it is often in times of crisis that the best businesses ideas arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think Portugal had a lot of best practices and an excellent case study to share with the world here, and exceptional response here. Let me ask my next question to Ms. Vicky Slaninou, Head of Advocacy and Policy at the Institute of Public Accountants in Australia. She's also an ICSB board member. So Vicky, here's my question. The Compendium argues that policy has to be adapted to the context to be efficient. In this case, what do you think what countries and regions can learn from each other in the field of entrepreneurship policy? And let me really focus on my question here. Australia was one of the best practices that ICSB has flagged in response to COVID-19. So maybe share your ideas and the response. What can we learn from each other?
Thanks, Simon, and greetings to everyone. I've been noting with interest all the different countries, so it really is a global audience, and thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a really good question because obviously you have to adapt policy to the particular context, and the Compendium sets that out. But at the same time, there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And, you know, at the end of the day, an entrepreneur is still an entrepreneur wherever they are, whatever region, whatever sector and industry. You know, essentially they innovate and they take risks. So what policies do we put into place to enable them and to facilitate them to take the risks and to be able to innovate? And I think one of the things that the Compendium does really well with the 16 case studies, and I've read most of it. I mean, I've gone through the whole Compendium, and I must say it was very, very enlightening. And thanks to Jonathan for that really good, succinct overview. So, and the 16 case studies are really interesting, and there is one also from Australia. And what's interesting also, and it makes the point about how you can learn from each other, because the Australian case study is based on a measure to do with tax incentives that actually is based on a UK measure from many years ago. So it just goes to show how you can take a measure, you know, a policy from one jurisdiction and transplant it successfully into another jurisdiction, even over time. So I found that one particularly interesting, and it was successful in both places with the adaptation that was necessary. So I think there's a lot that we can definitely learn from each other. And what I found interesting with the Compendium also was that the case studies have at the end of them what lessons we can take out of them to then transplant into other countries. So I think then it's a case of, well, how do you adapt? You know, which policies do you pick from other places and how do you adapt them? And to me, they're the big questions, because then you start looking at, well, what is specific to your context that is going to lend itself to being able to adapt. So you have a whole list of criteria, and the compendium goes through some of that. So I think it's very, very useful. And definitely, I mean, in our own country, in Australia, there's lots of things. I mean, I hope that we can also share some of our own learnings. And you know, we've spent a lot of time and money, and you know, the economy has gone into a huge deficit after nearly 3 decades of being quite prosperous. So, you know, trying to sort of boost the economy initially with recovery, and then going into sort of the road to recovery, you know, the response, recovery, and now reform. And I think we're all going to go into that stage of reform. So we're all going to have to adapt our policies and learn from each other. In addition to what's in the compendium, I think from my own experience, having been in both the public and the private sectors, I think, and this is something that the Growth Hub's case study brought to light, that I think that having political commitment and political buy-in is absolutely critical to success of entrepreneurship policies, and, you know, indeed all policies, because having that political commitment at the high level means that you're more likely to succeed and you're more likely to get the resources that you need, and you don't spend half your time fighting for the policies to be successful. I mean, I do a lot of advocacy in my role, so having that buy-in is absolutely critical. The other thing I think that we all need to learn, and especially sort of with COVID, is that even as policymakers, we need to be innovative ourselves. So it's one thing to say, yes, you know, we need innovation, we need policies to promote innovation and startups and entrepreneurs, but we also need to have a very open, innovative mindset ourselves. We need to be able to receive what we're hearing. So, you know, when we do consultation, it needs to be meaningful, it needs to be inclusive, because I've seen so many times, you know, lip service paid to consultation, for example. And the compendium again talks about delivery issues, and I can certainly say that delivery issues can totally kill a good policy. So, you know, what we say is that you're better off having excellent implementation of a second-rate policy than having bad implementation of a good policy. So I think that striking that balance is really important. So thanks, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Vicky. You're right to the point here, and so thank you very much. And before I ask the next question here, I want to recognize the founder of MSME Day at the United Nations, Ambassador Martin Garcia Moritan, is on the session here. So, and he's in Argentina, he's nodding his head. So let's give him a special thank you and applause, because without him, we wouldn't have had MSME Day at the United Nations. So I see you and we recognize you, Ambassador Moritan. Let me go to the next question here. This is for you, Professor Colin, and I'm a professor as well. So this is a professor to a professor question here. You ready? Entrepreneurship policy needs to respond to a wide range of different kinds of potential entrepreneurs coming from different sources. One of those untapped areas is the student body at universities, dear to my heart. Right? What do you think a good student startup scheme should look like? And this is a really great question for all the professors that are in this session here. The floor is yours.
Right, well, universities are clearly an important part of ecosystems, but they're also ecosystems in their own right. So it kind of illustrates my conceptualization of ecosystems a bit like a Russian doll, or the kind of hierarchy. There are national ecosystems, city ecosystems, and then smaller scale ecosystems within them. I think the role the universities can play in promoting entrepreneurship really has 3 elements. Somebody, I forget their name, suggested there's an inspire involvement, there's an engage involvement, and there's an accelerate involvement. So first of all, inspire. I think universities have to create entrepreneurial mindsets and entrepreneurial intentions amongst their students. And that can be done through entrepreneurship, building entrepreneurship education into the curriculum, extramural activities. Now, of course, as all the entrepreneurship professors around will know, well, I think the criticism, can you teach somebody to be entrepreneurial, has been won. The debate is around how you teach entrepreneurship. And I think there's now an acceptance that you have to teach it experientially. I read a quote that said, you can't teach somebody to swim in a library. Well, you can't teach a student to be entrepreneurial in a classroom. You have to give them experience, and certainly that's the way I teach business startups. So that's the first thing, to develop entrepreneurial intention. For those, and it's a funnel. For those students who do want to take it further, then you need to have support facilities available within the university to support students to develop their business ideas, develop their entrepreneurial learning, develop their ideas. And then the third stage then is for those students who actually have got an idea and actually wanting to start a business, then it's support for the venture. And that involves support from within the university, programs, support, one-to-one advice and mentoring is critical here. And then also, as I said in my earlier question, linking these students, these ventures, to the external ecosystem as well. So again, like everything we're talking about, it's multifaceted, and you need these three elements to address the kind of the pipeline, and hopefully the pipeline from the Inspire doesn't narrow too much down to the startup support element.
Thank you, Professor Mason. I want to recognize Norris Kruger for his exceptional work also on the report that he contributed to, and also Christina as well, and her work on ecosystems in France. Watch out for them. They're exceptional researchers here. My next question is Torsten Andersen here. From Torsten, here's my question. In the debate about building back better from the COVID-19 crisis, there has been discussion about how startups are needed in the transition to the new economy in a more sustainable model. So getting those startups in a more sustainable model here. What do you think is the most important specific policies to promote green entrepreneurship? I'm very specific here on green entrepreneurship. And how do you do that in practice? What separates green entrepreneurs from others?
Thank you very much. I think that's a bit moving on from my last intervention, that when we look at the direction of policy, at least in Denmark, we see an increasing focus on purpose and the green startups. So I think that politicians are still honoring, let's say, entrepreneurship as such, but in particular now they're looking for the purpose, and they believe that the young generation and everybody else are looking to actually increase the sort of creating a better world, and that's basically where you're heading. Now, when the politicians are moving in this direction, then of course, as policymakers, as trying to improve the ecosystems of our country, we have to sort of find ways of improving this, and that can be done in many ways. I mean, we've introduced a one-stop shop where green business models can test whether what they do is legal and in line with what they want to do. We have introduced green business support schemes, so on. I think the particular things for green businesses are, amongst other things, they're more capital intensive than what was my prejudgment. They are more, for us, they're more like life science rather than a tech startup. So you're basically in it for the long run if you want to create the green business support for the future.
Thank you, Torsten. Very good. So Andrew, I have a tough question for you. There are 3 questions in one here. So pick your poison, if you may. All right. How can we get the institutional conditions right to support entrepreneurship? What are the conditions to get them right for institutions? What do you think are some of the most important actions governments need to take to strengthen areas such as entrepreneurial culture and regulatory framework? That's another one. And then finally, a lot of progress seems to have been made. Are there still gains to be made, and from what interventions? It's a difficult question, but how would you put it all together?
It's quite an easy answer, actually, Eamon. I'm glad you gave me an easy questions. I'm going to take the second one first. That's the easy answer. Just read the report that we're talking about. That's the first step that governments can take, because I think it's a very good report, as people say, and it covers a lot of the things which need to be done. And taking them more broader, I think one of the one of the key things which governments need to do, and again, it's very clearly put out in the report, and it's one thing that governments don't do very well. It's monitor, evaluate, and listen. And I think a great piece of which stood out to me in the paper is you've got to have the framework to talk to the entrepreneurs who have failed, who have been successful, because it gets a little bit back to what I was saying in the first time. It's in that region what works. And if you want to roll things out, be more expansive in what you're trying to do, then that's sort of, if you're not listening to what the people are who are at the coalface and who are facing everything day to day, then all the lovely policies in the world are going to be really nice hanging on a wall in your office, but they're not going to be helping people at the coalface and in the real world. So I think getting also there's lots talked about the ecosystems, but you've got your regulatory frameworks, the culture, but it's also the capacity building to support the developments going forward. And that's going to be different in tough times or in good times, but you've got to constantly have this loop of evaluation and feedback to learn from mistakes and to learn from triumphs.
Thank you, Andrew. And I promise I won't ask you any more difficult questions for the time being. Let me switch to the next panelist here. Anna, this was interesting when I saw your title, right? And I'm going to ask you based on the title that you have. You are the head of the unit of business policy unit at the Ministry of Economy and Digital Transition of Portugal here. That title struck me, right? So here's my question. What is the impact of digital transformation on entrepreneurship, and what does the government need to do, especially if your ministry is called Digital Transition? So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayman. So digital transition and transition of entrepreneurship, digital entrepreneurship has a great relevance in the current context, we believe, with the possibility of transformation business models using digital resources and solutions. It seeks to embrace a transformative approach to redefine current businesses models using up-to-date digital technologies. Again, the COVID pandemic has revealed several challenges that can and should be faced by SMEs and startups as businesses opportunities. First, there are opportunities for startups to introduce or upscale innovations that can be useful in short run. Second, the COVID-19 outbreak induced changes in consumer habits or needs, e-commerce, remote working, online education, and these shifts could boost business opportunities, especially for those startups that are able to anticipate changes. Raise awareness of the potential of emerging technologies in transformation and automating SMEs' business process and enabling them to engage with business partners and consumers in global networks needs to be a priority. This crisis also shown the need to empower users in digital skills with a particular focus on consumers and SMEs. In this context, and having in mind that we have now a Minister of Economy and Digital Transitions since last year, we add digital transition. Portugal has assumed a clear commitment to improve digital skills both through the National Action Plan for Digital Transition and InCode program, an integrated public policy initiative aimed at enhancing digital competencies. In fact, digitalization was assumed as a political priority in Portugal even before the pandemic. For instance, under Startup Portugal program, mentioned previously, we have Startup Visa, welcoming program for foreign entrepreneurs, Tech Visa, attracting qualified staff, Startup Voucher, monthly scholarship, or e-residency, a new concept of virtual citizenship based on decentralized public services, which aims to attract more than 5,000 digital nomads, businessmen, and foreigner investors. During COVID-19, Portugal launched the National Action Plan for Digital Transition, which is structured around three fundamental pillars: capacity building and digital inclusion, businesses digital transformation, and public services digitization. and a cross-cutting catalytic dimension, working as an instrument to accelerate the digital transition of the country. The focus on businesses' digital transformation pillar is based mainly on measures and actions that deliver supports for investments, stimulate digitalization of companies, and raise awareness and training, in particular of SMEs and startups, and promote the development of initiatives that contribute to the consolidation of scientific and technological businesses' knowledge. Digital transformation is one of the most promising and viable strategies to accelerate recovery and sustain growth. The current pandemic situation has put even more perspective the importance of digital tools, so firms and entrepreneurs are faced with an imperative challenge to follow innovative, digital, and sustainable strategies. Portugal will assume on January 1st the presidency of the Council of the European Union for 6 months, and digital transformation in all its dimensions, including entrepreneurship, will be a top priority on Portuguese agenda. It is our commitment that Portugal be recognized not as a startup nation, but as a digital nation. Thank you, Ayman.
Thank you, Anna. And so now for all of the attendees here, start putting your questions in the chat section here, if it's for everyone or one in particular, and we'll go through them as much as possible here. So while you're thinking of your question, I have one final question here, right? And I want to build on what the chair of ICSB said, Mr. Ahmed Osman said, saying, you know, it's all good and happy and nice to do this, but at the bottom line, we need funding, we need support, and we need it now. So Vicky, here's my question to you here. What do you think the entrepreneurship policy needs to go further, more? What should we be focusing in entrepreneurship policy here, based on what we've heard here? You know, it's a tough question, and Jonathan mentioned saying, what's the future like here? So again, as you think of your questions here, I'm asking the most difficult question to Vicky, because she's the last panelist, but also kind of to get you times to kind of formulate your questions. Vicky, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Simon. Well, I think this is a good one for debate that everyone can get involved with, because I'm sure everyone's got different ideas about entrepreneurship in the future. I see it as two things. First, the immediate future. A lot of entrepreneurs and startups are basically going to be exiting. So what we're doing here is trying to pick the winners and the losers. So as Jonathan was saying before about the productive entrepreneurs, we're focusing on the productive entrepreneurs because they're the ones likely to create the jobs. So what do we need? You know, obviously there's a lot of policies going towards capital and just keeping the money flowing to them. There's a lot of new policies coming out at the moment that we're looking at that go towards viability testing and restructuring. So the real nuts and bolts of getting them through COVID and the economic implications of COVID. So that's kind of the immediate thing, is just keeping them alive, so to speak. And then once we've kind of picked those, how are we going to get them to be prosperous, and how are we going to promote entrepreneurship and innovation into the future? And one of the things that we're doing, which has been controversial because not everyone agrees, is again picking winners and losers. So like, for instance, the government has picked 6 particular industries that it's really focusing on. So if you happen to be an entrepreneur or a startup in one of those particular industries, then you're more likely to get support, you're more likely to get a decent ecosystem happening and all the, you know, all the institutional support that you need. If you're not in one of those, you know, anointed 6 areas, then, you know, you're going to have to rely on all the other policies that exist. So that's kind of what we're doing, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so let me start asking some questions here, and I'm just going to start with the most recent one here, right? And I'll go from there. Norris says here, funding for firms. Yes, but what? Oh, I lost it here, but let me just go here quickly. Hey, Norris, you have I think it's done intention. Norris, unmute and ask your question.
Hi, so thanks. I meant, and first of all, thanks to OECD for letting me be involved in writing the compendium. That's just been feeling really good. Well, my question was that we were talking about funding. We also, there are a lot of players in the ecosystem who are very effective, but they're not getting funded. And the ineffective ones these are the bottom-up ones who are led by the voice of the entrepreneur, but the ones who are top-down, they're led by the institutions, are getting the money and influence. How do we address that? How do we channel money to the ecosystem builders as opposed to the ecosystem bullies?
Okay, good. That's the next question.
In harsh terms.
You know who came to my mind? Torsten. Torsten mentioned that they went through this process. So Torsten, how did you go? How did you figure this out? It's who do you know, or is it based on metrics? How did you figure out the balance here?
Thanks. And I said we went through it, but I didn't say we solved it, because basically it's very difficult. And I agree very much that it's the issue. Basically, I mean, what we did was that when we were closing down these 50 plus public organizations in our entrepreneurship ecosystem support system, basically we experienced that the people who were most against were the public bureaucrats. It wasn't the entrepreneurs. So basically that in itself, you know, discussing with the entrepreneurs who's actually giving you value is a very good place to start, because what we saw was that the organizations that are popular with the entrepreneurs are the ones that are led by the entrepreneurs themselves. And that's how you actually can sort of tell which ones are part of the ecosystem, along with then what I'm sure Jonathan would say if he was on. Well, look at the KPIs and look at the effect. I mean, basically, if you, for example, match up different incubators or acceleration programs, you can see which has an effect and which doesn't.
So, Torsten, that is the most honest and most transparent answer there is. I want to commend you for this, because it's a difficult question here. So this is a question coming from I think it was captured for us, but Colin, you and I are going to ask this question to Jonathan just to give him a hard time. So Jonathan, here's the question, because we're professors here, so we're going to ask the professorial question here. How does entrepreneurial ecosystems support productive entrepreneurship? And we're going to underline, Colin underline productive entrepreneurship twice, right? How do you address this question?
I think it's just, we can go the other way around. I mean, it's what we don't support, because productive entrepreneurship is more or less everything that we want, that's got a survivability, you know, and innovation content. And it's basically about having something distinct in the enterprise. I think we all know that the problem of entrepreneurship policy, it's the chicken shop, they're calling that in the UK. It's the taxi driver. It's those people who are keen to go into industries where we know that they've got very little chance of being able to make a decent living, and probably if they take a subsidy are going to make life very difficult for those already there. So we need some sort of filter and selection process to not support these. And I think there's two ways of doing that. There's an ex-ante approach where you build selection into your policy process, and you only allow people to participate in programs that you judge as being in sectors that are not excess supply, or having business plans that you judge as being suitable. That's one approach. The second approach is actually to delay your support and to provide your support after 3 years. Once the business has demonstrated that it is survivable and it's got something to offer. And that's actually a very novel way of thinking about entrepreneurship policy, to support startups, but not at the start.
Okay, I like the twist. Let me ask this question. It's a twofold question, but it's coming from the chair of ICSB, Ahmed Osman, but then it was complemented by Kiseben, right? And so Ahmed says, what about the entrepreneur managing a small company, a micro SME, right? And they're talking about cash flow, they're talking about investments and funding here. And then Kiseben says, ask the same question, right? But they're saying, listen, it's about livelihood, it's productivity. So my question goes both to Vicky, first of all, because I know Australia did an exceptional job to address this, and Anna as well, because, you know, as a country, as a government, you have to address everybody, not just one particular group. So let's start with Vicky.
Yeah, definitely you have to support all groups. And it's been quite controversial in Australia, where the government has, you know, picked winners and losers, as we call them. And a lot of even within government are saying, no, you shouldn't be picking winners and losers. You should be setting, you know, the scene, the context, and letting the market pick the winners and the losers, no matter what sectors they're in. So, I mean, but you know, having said that, the government has definitely, a lot of money has flown right through to every small business and every startup. So, you know, but the reality is you can't support everybody. There isn't enough funding and resources to go around. So you have to make a selection at some point. And at the moment, it's, you know, there are more resources going to those who are going to be able to create jobs and getting, you know, more bang for your buck. And that's just kind of the reality. What's also happened is that it's being made easier for companies to restructure, and if it's found that they're going to be insolvent and they're going to have to exit, making that process a lot easier as well, because there's a lot of resources that get tied up in actually companies exiting and businesses exiting. But, you know, yes, the reality is that it would be great to support everyone, but we just can't. So we have to be selective.
Okay, Anna?
Yeah, I agree with what Vicky has said, but of course we are also focused on the second chance, because sometimes things doesn't work, but of course doesn't work in that conditions, but entrepreneurs, of course, startups could have a second chance. So of course we need to focus on that also. And I think that's it. I think that's it.
Okay, so here's a question for Andrew here, because Andrew wrote an exceptional report a while back for ICSB here. And I wanna bring it together, and I also saw Ines mention something here, and this goes for all the panelists here. And the question is, we talk about inclusive entrepreneurship, right? Let me focus on women entrepreneurs, okay? Right? If we're gonna pick between one group or the other, we know clearly right from the bat that women entrepreneurs do not have the same chances or support as men entrepreneurs. Winslow Sargent, the incoming chair of ICSB, has mentioned this many times, that women entrepreneurs do not have the same privileges and availability as men entrepreneurs. How do we address this? Andrew, you had some best practices on this, so maybe you can share.
I'm going to start off when I started off last time. Every region is different, and I think if you look at different countries, it's also very different. So understanding, if you like, the fabric of the area that they're operating and at the time that they're operating is the first place to start, and then working with them on their challenges, whether it may be access to finance, it might be in relation to actually just the labor laws, very different in a lot of the different countries, but that's where I would probably start.
Okay, did any of the panelists want to jump in on this one? I know I asked the difficult questions here. Let me ask another question here, and this is coming from Barbara here. Israel's ecosystem, which uses the office of the chief scientist at the national level of financial support, right? And says here, and she talks a little bit about here, talks about it being successful. Do we need offices like this in different governments to deal with this? Colin, you raise your hand.
Absolutely. I've had the privilege of making several visits to Australia in the last few years, and a couple of the states there, South Australia and Queensland, have the office of the chief entrepreneur, who's a voice at the top level of government, just as the same as the office of the chief medical officer or wherever. I think that's critically important. I don't really think, I mean, it's a generalization, but honestly, I don't think politicians really have enough empathy with small business owners. They don't have enough understanding of them. I mean, we see that in terms of how they're dealing with COVID, expecting businesses to shut down and then open up and shut down and open up again. So I really think that having a respected entrepreneur who can speak truth to power at the top level of government, and to speak across government as well, because we know that all departments of government impact the small business sector. It's not just the kind of department of business or the department of finance. So I think I've been advocating this in Scotland, that Scotland should create an office of the chief entrepreneur. I don't expect it'll be successful, but I do think that this Australian initiative, these Australian initiatives are well worth investigating further.
Thanks, Colin. I want to hand it back to Jonathan here, so he can maybe jump in with some comments, and then we'll wrap up the session. Jonathan?
All right. Well, I mean, it's great. It's stimulating. And great discussion. We can't resolve everything. We've got an agenda for the next version of the compendium. I don't know when that'll come out, but there's a lot more to resolve here. What I'm really interested in now is what's the future like for entrepreneurship policy? I think that's what we've got to delve into more. And there were a couple of things that that really struck me in what we heard. One was the green entrepreneurship, and the other was the digital entrepreneurship. And in fact, you know, you had Anna from Portugal who talked about the aim to be both a digital nation and a startup nation, and I did like that very much. But it comes into, you know, how are we actually going to do it? What are the measures that are actually going to work? I think everybody shares that objective. Let's be digital, but what? And so she's got startup visa, tech visa, startup voucher, e-residency. There was a range of things the Portuguese government has introduced, and we need to find out what works there in that setup, and can it be transferred? And then the other thing was, of course, the direction of entrepreneurship policy in Denmark, Torsten was saying, is about purpose, supporting entrepreneurship that has a purpose. That purpose could be green, it could be social, but how do you support this specifically? And it'd be very interesting to see, how does that one-stop shop actually work? How does it function? Do the entrepreneurs appreciate it? Where he said you can test if your business model is legal. So, you know, and then the green business support schemes. And he said you need long-term and you need capital-intensive support in this sector. So that, for me, is what we need to know more about. What measures work in those areas?
Thank you, Jonathan. For ICSB, and these are my concluding remarks here, we focus on the human aspect of everything here. We call this at ICSB humane entrepreneurship. At the end of the day, whatever we're doing and whatever level we are, then we are dealing with human beings at different levels. Humanity now is hurting a lot. And whatever policies that we're doing, whatever initiatives we're doing here, the underlying bottom line is, how can we help humanity move forward? And maybe that's the flagship for 2021, is how do we move collectively together with all the best practices there are, and also sharing the worst practices. Don't do this. This doesn't work. Focus your resources and time and talent on something else here. So for us, this compendium comes at a perfect time here, because it asks the right questions. It gives us a benchmark. It gives us a starting point for what we call a better humanity, or we call humane entrepreneurship. With that, I want to hand it back. My role as moderator has ended. I want to hand it back to Cynthia, and we go from there. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to host you as a moderator for this session.
Thank you very much, Ayman, and thank you to all our panelists and our speakers today. I think we're leaning to the end of the session, so we can probably close it here, but I think we can, we'll see if some of my colleagues want to add the final word, but I think we can all thank our speakers and panelists for this excellent session, and also the audience for this very lively conversation and insightful questions that really informed the conversation today. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.